basically within the fundamentals of the existing anticipated development application, and does a great many little band-aids and substantial other changes that cumulatively make it a much better project, we think, against the Lifestyle 2020 guidelines. This up here is a quite different plan for the same place that represents a choice, and we can't force the owners to do this, and we don't presume to do so. And this is quite early on. This was just done this afternoon. But we think that it may have some assets in terms of both for the community environment and economics of Lake Macquarie and North Lakes, but also possibly for the owners. The town center stays the same. You can see that it's virtually unchanged, and the school. I drew that differently. Wendy and I weren't coordinated with that. It's the same school system. The connection to Minmine Road stays the same, and the connections down to whatever this town is down here stay the same. The differences have to do with, and this is no particular order of priority, a forthcoming, hopefully forthcoming, general development control plan for Lake Macquarie, which is modeled to a large extent on the Western Australia Livable Neighborhoods Community Design Code, which has smaller street systems, smaller street widths, generally substantially smaller, which, along with slowing the traffic, also cost less. And they mean more developable land at the same time because they consume less area, at least in terms of width. Lake Macquarie and Newcastle build on 25% slope now, and it desecrates the land. It involves massive cutting and fill, especially with smallish lots like the ones that are in this DCP of around 700 square meters for the most part. When you have 1,000 square meters or 2,000 square meter lots, and it's very, very steep, then it actually is doable, and furthermore, it also doesn't trash the trees. But one of the concerns that this design brings, and to some extent this design as well, but less so, I think, is the degree of cut and fill and earth moving that is required. Basically, for example, this right here is an existing creek that is proposed to be kept here. And in here, it's all within pipes. When the land is bumpy like this, that means that the D9 gets out and for the most part levels everything, including every blade of grass and every tree that's in this area. And I may be somewhat wrong, and I may be somewhat exaggerating, and if I am, I apologize, but relatively speaking, it basically restructures the landform so that this street system can work within it. And one of the key things that it does, and by the way, this doesn't necessarily mean that the sedimentation problems, they do get more extreme, but they can definitely be handled. And I'm certain that the developer, if this goes forward, will handle the sedimentation problems. It's just a lot more to handle because there's a lot more moving of earth, and so there's the risk of more soluble soils going into all of the sandbags, and all of that part gets more expensive. Greg P. What's Greg's name with the council? Greg P. Jones, who is an engineer with the council, did for me a comparative cost along this right here, for instance, and along this right here. And to make a long story short, the cost of putting a creek underground with a street over it in a great big pipe, and the earth moving associated with that, and the chopping down and mulching of all the trees that would need to be removed from the site. They can't be burned. They need to be chopped up and mulched and then carried off the site. That costs, at least according to Greg, compared to having what's shown here, which is a 5.3 meter curb-to-curb street, very narrow little delicate street along here. That's all of these here in about a 10-meter reserve, much smaller reserves that are presently located here. just wide enough. And by the way, that's potentially a two-way street, but literally very low volume. It's a very low volume condition. And when two cars approach each other, one needs to move over. And that slows the traffic. And that's the idea. It's a very, very slow speed street. Because people otherwise they run into each other. So it has to be a slow speed street. But there's very, very low travel demand along these edges compared to these streets, for instance, which is the bus routes. Greg P. Jones did a comparison of this where all of the creek bed is kept and where the cut basically starts at the street, at the edge of the street, and it's relatively small cut even on the land. It's basically treading very much more lightly on the land. And at the same, and what, to my surprise, he calculated was that this alternative, compared to all of the cost associated with putting a creek in a big pipe underneath an 8-meter curb-to-curb road, the cost of doing this was less per linear meter than the cost of putting the creek under the pipe. Now, that came as a surprise to me, and I'm not sure that we're right, but it's close. In other words, he said definitely what I am describing and proposing here is not pie in the sky. But there's a few other aspects between this and this design that fall into place here that I think are very important in terms of the profits and also the speed of absorption of this development for sales that have a lot to do with amenity. And it also has a lot to do with the difference, a characteristic difference between this design and this design. In this design, there is almost constant curving of the streets. It's probably hard to find a straight street here. And it's very well engineered for this, by the way, within this, this principle of design. This design is a drastically different principle that I think makes the sales, the cumulative value of each lot higher by means of the straight streets and by means of the continuous streets along the edge. Because if you live right here, or I'm just going to talk about along this creek that we think might be about the same or perhaps cheaper to preserve, it obviously means less buildable land in that particular area, though, because that creek width is 30 to 40 meters wide. So it's losing buildable land for sure. But it means that each of the houses here looks straight down these straight streets, straight to the creek. So instead of this area, right, let me just do an example. This right here is only about 100 meters from the creek, but you can't tell you're near the creek when you're here. This you can't tell. This whole experience along here might as well be in Edgeworth. It's not near this creek. It might as well be anywhere, as a matter of fact. It is anonymous in terms of the place. But this street here, which is the corollary street along which the buses pass, has all of these straight streets, and every 80 or 70 meters, you can actually look down and see the darn creek every which way. This is about, and by the way, it's hard to see down a street that's straight more than about 400 meters unless you've got just giant trees. After that, it begins to be sort of an anticlimax at the end. But this distance is about 150 meters, and that is a great view for all of these houses along here. You walk out on your front veranda or get into your car, and every day you know you're on that creek because you can see it. And I would submit that that has a significant return in real estate value per lot, maybe of $3,000 per lot. It's not a lot, but when you start adding it up, it means a lot. It also means that the creeks are preserved, and I think that there is a substantial market out there that would rather live in a place that they know preserves the creeks, or as many of the creeks as possible, rather than a place that they know has actually nuked virtually all of the creeks. That's a very important distinction between these two. The Western Australia Community Code street system for this bus, by the way, and Wendy's plan could do the same thing, but she, in order to show the contrast, drew it differently. This is about 10.5 meters curb to curb for buses. The entire state of Western Australia has accepted this for buses. They don't have better bus drivers than this state. So it ought to work here as well. And it's a 20-meter reserve in here, both of which are narrower than what's being obligated presently by the city of Lake Macquarie for buses. So we propose, by the way, that the staff seriously consider this. If the whole state of WA can do it, I don't see why Lake Macquarie bus drivers can't do it as well. So these are all smaller streets at the same time. They also have less of an underground drainage requirement because these can, roughly speaking, drain straight to its own detention basin and nutrient stripping basin before offline of the creeks before it goes into the creeks, which means more maintenance for whoever does that, and that's a problem that I think is worth it. But it's more maintenance. Make no mistake about it. Now, another big difference between this plan and this plan, which means slightly, but not a lot less developable land, is that whereas this has the 200-meter wide passage for habitat, which is a dead end, as Wendy has explained already, this has the same passage that in this spot has been somewhat narrowed from this 200-meter requirement. But it comes to this very large area, which is actually the epicenter of the best habitat on the entire site. And it gives it another way through that you can see here that doesn't exist here. This one down here exists, but it's much more urban and it's far too narrow. This is at least 100 meters from curb to curb, which we understand it won't work for all of the habitat. This is not a perfect solution, but we think it's a better solution than this being a dead end, because this is the best habitat, but it's in a dead end, whereas this is the best habitat and it can flow through. It also has this land up here. This has encroached onto the 200-meter width here, but those of you who know the topography of this realize that it's actually quite flat in here until you get straight to the creek. It's only about a 6 or 7% slope in here. It's imminently buildable land, and this particular scheme proposes that this habitat flow through here may work at least as well, if not perhaps better, than this one, which is a dead end. This edge over here is important as well. There's another break here. And this becomes an island, but this is a very decisive island. These are actually, another appeal of this plan to me is that they're islands. They're little islands of development. And the people that live here, and by the way, the people that probably, if I were they, are going to walk around this island and walk up this creek, are going to get to know each other as the people that live in whatever this little island is called. As a matter of fact, these people will feel that they're quite special in themselves, as will these. This over here is located like this because this roundabout, because this is on a hill, is all three legs of it are in a deep cutting that's got roadbed material and that's been defoliated and has very little opportunity for habitat to cross here like squirrel gliders, because it's actually about a 40 or even 50 meter wide break, and that's further than a squirrel glider can make when their car's about to mow it down. There is a space right here, however, that is actually quite narrow, that's already built, where and this over here is all habitat. This is all bush on this side. And this is a place where actually the squirrel gliders and other fauna and flora, including endangered fauna and flora, can go like this, from this huge area of bush over here, like this, and through here. And hopefully this can be refoliated as well, but it's a deep cutting, and if we relied on that alone, we determined that it would not work until it was reforested, which might take 20 years. So in the meantime, this is a crossing here, and that is what has triggered this, along with something else. The something else, when you see big patches like this of bush, and this big patch of bush here, and this big patch of bush here, not only does this have 6 hollowed out trees that may well be habitat for endangered species, but this is very steep in here. This is all well over 20%, and a good deal of it is in the range of 30% through here. It can be built on, but it's expensive to build on. And we think that the owners might recognize that instead of spending a great deal of money in an area that isn't particularly nice here, that instead they could have much cheaper to build, but as a result, much, much more profitable land, because it looks across to this habitat corridor, and because it has access to Minmai Road by means of this, which is a delicate, delicate little 2-lane bridge. It could almost be a 1-lane bridge right at the cross, but it's not a creek, so it doesn't matter here. That's just a 2-lane road. 5.5 meters wide, very narrow, so that this is an easy habitat condition. So this is too steep easily to be built on, and that's why this is a big block. These would be big lots. These would be lots that would be 1,200 square meters, because in there it's 35% slope. In here it's 35% slope. So these are big lots, and we think that there's a market for big lots, but the market is, and the only way to build on those is to have big lots. So what we're proposing here is a much greater diversity of lots than the original DCP, which is almost all about 700 square meters. Instead, to have some great big lots where there is really, really steep stuff, like here and here, and at the same time to have relatively dense lots. And because there is so much nice frontage along here, this scheme, as opposed to this scheme, is proposing somewhat more medium density development along here, just because we think that the amenity is so high of this area that the developer might be able to sell it when it's only about a 3 or 4 minute walk to this, and it's also it's a minute and a half walk to the bus stops. So that's what's driving these little islands. It also encroaches into the LEP up here, and it's got, but it in no case exceeds or is too narrow, we think, for the habitat. It is too narrow for some of the habitat, but we think that it's survivable in this condition. And so there are some, we haven't had a chance to calculate the land area of this to compare the returns per se. I'm only giving you principles about components of the design. But we have narrowed this. What we've tried to do is to improve the amenity substantially, to improve the sales and absorption by means of the better habitat and the better views for many more lots, because they're straight streets. And we don't know whether this will pencil out, but we think that it may sell appreciably better than this one, may be absorbed faster, and it would put a huge white hat on this developer. It actually could trigger the transformation of new development in this entire region towards this kind of development, away from this kind of development in terms of the creeks and the mixed use, as could this. This is a white hat development at the same time, but this is a much bigger white hat if the guy is a Texan like me. Okay, now we can talk about the last thing, which is the railroad. Let me see, we're the railroad. By the way, this is real. I mean, this proposal is real, and it is definitely award-winning. It's got a lot of challenges to it. This is the high-speed freight rail. If you don't mind holding it, that'll be great. And let's see, yeah. Lynn, what is your last name? Regan. Lynn Regan was kind enough to provide us with a different plan that this is based on, and there are what Lynn provided us with was these dotted lines. By the way, here's Lake Macquarie. Here is Morisset down here. North Lakes is right here, and the proposed route that Lynn has provided us with, that is, I think Lynn is a representative of the State Rail Investment Board or whatever, and are working for them. This is the proposed, the primary proposed route, going like this. And it's about 25 kilometers long, and each case where you see the red dots, it means that the existing rail line is to be abandoned, and it's to be much faster. I said it had to be a straighter line and couldn't go up and down as much. And this does substantial things. For instance, over here, it misses Morisset entirely. And those of you that know what's going, and it also goes through the Kumpatu land. And those of you that know Morisset will realize that Morisset is actually one of the really quite brilliant transit-oriented development opportunities of all of Lake Macquarie. But it actually relocates the rail away from the Morisset's quite beautiful and viable town center and station. So it abandons a key lifeblood of Morisset. It also, and I won't go through all the details, but it actually nukes a great deal of urban fabric along the way. But what it does through here is that it goes straight through North Lakes, the stuff that I've been presenting. And
You're ready for this? You just need to move that out of the way. And I'll
okay, you can move it over.
these on.
Thank you, Wendy.
So you have to put one because it needs to
Okay.
be taller. Just put that up. You just got to
Let's
go
see.
and match this up to George Booth Drive to here, and that one along to there, down.
No,
there.
oh, just a little to the right, right like that.
Yep, that looks pretty good.
Thank you.
Okay, that's the first one.
What I'm going to explain, by the way, this is early days, and no one has had time to do the detailed engineering and the cost feasibility, et cetera, but there's a very, very strong political push which might have something to do with the forthcoming state election to be trumpeting this. And it actually could do a great deal of good for Newcastle and Lake Macquarie if we get it in the right place. This route that goes through here is now shown on here, and it's the red one. And it goes basically, it misses the town center by 50 meters, the epicenter of the town center by 50 meters. And this, by the way, is supposed to be on the 20-meter contour, but this right here above sea level, but this is about 45 or 40-meter contour right here. So it actually would either go in a giant cutting or in a very expensive tunnel that's not part of the present proposal as we understand it. And this route, as far as we can tell, is actually, along with being quite damaging to this proposed plan, is incredibly expensive because it actually goes, it's supposed to stay on the 20-meter contour, but it goes merrily through 40 and 45 and 50-meter contours while it's trying to stay on 20-meter contours before it gets to 20 again. So it's not a little bit of a ditch, it's the Grand Canyon in terms of infrastructure costs. We also studied this, and because once we discovered that, then we were informed of this being an alternate route over here. The one I've just explained goes to the west of Barnsdale, between Holmesville and Barnsdale. It doesn't do them much good either. By the way, this train at 120 kilometers per hour is incredibly noisy, especially the freight trains, to the point where normally such infrastructure needs a setback for habitable dwellings of noise of between 200 and 400 meters on either side. It's massive in the noise. And it's a very good thing, but we got to get it in the right place. So if it went between here and here, these people would permanently jerk and wear earphones. This route here is somewhat less intrusive, we think, and it's this one. And it as well has considerable difficulties. There's that other drawing.
You can take that one off.
Actually, we can leave it on and just put that over it.
I think it's easy to read this one.
Okay.
Okay.
How does this work?
Here, and center. Up a little bit.
That's good enough.
Yep.
So this is hard to read. I apologize. But it's pretty compelling. These little squiggles mean blasting noise because the train is above the ground on a fill. And in between, this means a cut, which means the train is in a deep cut. It's a bumpy land, in other words. Fill, cut, fill, cut, fill, cut. So it's going to be incredibly noisy and then in a cut, and then incredibly noisy and then in a cut, and incredibly noisy and then in a cut, and then it goes in a cut through here, which is right very close. It actually goes right through the proposed bulky goods area. And it might even be a tunnel, but it's not shown as a tunnel in the original proposal that Len Regan gave us. So it's actually more and more expense in this case. So the impacts to these neighborhoods and to the town center are quite substantial in terms of noise, as well as just being able to bridge across all these giant cuttings, which would be, to get down 15 or 20 meters, the cutting itself would be, at the top, much wider than this room is wide. I mean, it's just colossal dimensions. Okay, so in the face of recognizing this, we studied another route that Lynn Regan had mentioned, and it's along the freeway. And Ken Friesian and David Pavitt have done a brilliant job of assessing that alternative. And I think that they did it. They're on the council staff in the engineering department. I think they did it also because they were pretty concerned about this one, this route. And this was only a few hours of work, so it surely has room for improvement. But this is a scheme that from Hexham connects to the eastern side of the freeway and runs parallel to the freeway, so that here, for instance, it would be running along here. And it would be noisy for the golfers. It, by the way, is about 400 meters from West Wallsend, fortunately. And we would probably want to deal with some sound walls in here at the same time. And it's noisy for the industry, which is making noise anyway. And it's noisy for Killingworth, but it's not, it's again 200 or 300 meters from Killingworth, rather than going through this way and being equally as close to Killingworth on this side. So it's not, neither route is particularly good for Killingworth. But this route, we think, is much better because it doesn't go through the heart of the future of this whole region. And at the same time, it does the same service to the economy. Now, what Ken and David have done is to identify the key hard spots. And they are all of these, and they're identified on here, and you can study them if you want. They've done copies of the interchanges that you can see, and the red lines, which you can't see very well, explain what is involved to get through them. In this case, it's going, because this cross street of Palmer Road is elevated, the train goes beneath that in a little bitty short tunnel. And so all of this is explained, and it seems to us, we've got our fingers crossed, that it is a fraction of the cost, or at least as cost effective as all the other alternative, which we think appears, at least up here, to be more costly to build. It also needs to go through a giant tunnel at the ridge of the Link Road that was shown as 300 meters, but the best we can figure it's more like 500 or 600 meters of tunnel beneath the Link Road in order to start at 20 elevation and finish at 20 elevation, roughly speaking, or start at 30 and finish at 20 with the proper grades. So all of these seem to be expensive but doable, and it connects down south of Morisset, right here at the closest point of the rail to the freeway for a great distance. And so it would go through YE. And this is, for instance, something like a 300-meter long. How long is that, Ken or David? Are you here? It's a quite long bridge to get into here. But in terms of these things, it's not critical. And for instance, this crossing here is also a key habitat area. And by being a bridge, it lets the habitat connection, which is the only one in the region, still exist and flourish. So this is definitely, if this goes through, the preferred route as far as we can tell, to put it mildly. Thank you. Let me see. That's actually all I can think of right now. I'm rather burned out. Thank you for listening. Are there questions, comments, criticisms?
Can I just make a point, Chip? I can see where you've tackled the consolidation and perhaps the racetrack part of it around the lake. But to be honest, as far as the lake sediment goes, there's been a large area of what is now bushland earmarked for clearing for either industrial or proposed residential areas. As far as the detention basins go and that technology, it's unproven in the longer term, and I would suggest that to clear the amount of bushland that's proposed is only likely to increase burdens on the lake as far as sediment and nutrients go. And I think a lot more could have been done to consolidate existing areas and not not extend the amount of loss of bushland in the city. And to be honest, when you look at Edgeworth, it looks like a developer's glad bag there, to be honest. And not so much within the city part, that's fine, but if you look where the amount of industrial land that's earmarked, that represents a quite massive clearance of forest and towards the freeway there.
Edgeworth?
No, sorry.
You mean this?
Killingworth.
Or this? You mean this?
Mm.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Okay, yep.
But-
I think that you have very good points, and you may be right, and we may be wrong, and all this represents is an attempt to deal with the three-legged stool of responsible ecological development.
Yeah.
And that is protecting the environment and at the same time making the community work and making the economics work.
That's
And-
true, I accept there's trade-offs there, but
Yeah.
just saying, particularly in that area, that a lot's been sacrificed for
Yeah,
what's
it may or may not be sacrificed, but we don't need to have a difference of opinion, and I actually don't presume to suggest that we're right. I propose that this be tested in greater detail. Yes, great.
Your ideas for North Lakes I find very interesting, particularly the top plan. Is there anywhere in Western Australia or other parts of Australia where these straight streets have been tried in recent developments in a bushland setting that we could go and have a look at?
Help me, Wendy.
In recent development, I mean, there are plenty
In a
of historic
bushland
examples.
setting.
Yeah, but
There
they're
are
not-
trillions
they're not
of
in
them
bushland.
around.
There won't be any much bushland left on either plan because it's being urbanised.
No,
So
in
you
existing
mean-
developments that have straight streets into bushland.
Oh, you mean the
new
views into
developments.
bushland?
Yeah.
Well, again, recent developments, certainly the one that I was involved with some years ago, just in National Mutual, was straight streets looking down into a valley full of
That's
red
right.
gums, was one I
Yep.
talked about earlier in the week. That's been built and is on the ground, and you do feel a very close affinity with the landscape. A number of other examples that have happened in Victoria, but you've got to remember that most of Victoria's growth is not in bushland, because in fact that's being protected and it's on very flat basalt land. But again, with the straight streets there, what's been done is they've been used to highlight on the distant mountains.
But examples of it here, of straight streets terminating on the lake, like the one at Warner's Bay. You've got lots of examples to consider, but there are not a lot of development. This is actually early, relatively speaking, early days. I can point you, if you want to take a vacation to America, I can send you a bunch of them. It's not that this has never been done, and it's not being done now. It's actually being regarded as in the most recent equitable real estate, God, what's the name of the book? Emerging Trends in Real Estate. This type of development is touted as America's up and coming and most important topic of development, mixed use with straight streets like this. But, and there are probably 40 or 50 now that are out of the ground that I could show you in America. And maybe they're not good, but they seem to be good, and they're selling extremely well, which is why they were touted in that major magazine, which comes out annually, as one of the most important investment opportunities in the United States. Yeah.
You'll have to forgive me, I'm going to have to leave, but I've got a couple
I don't blame you.
if you'll excuse me. I like both those two alternatives, and particularly the top one, but neither of them will get off the ground under the way things work currently, because once upon a time, a greater broad-nosed bat was heard to squeak in the area. There's no evidence of him living there, but he was heard to squeak in the area where we reduced the bushland. So I believe that will probably stop them from happening. However, I'm sure we would like them to be able to happen in that. The other thing, excuse me if I get a bit paranoid, but I notice you've moved the railway line across the North Lakes development. But in moving it, you've just run it through the back door and out the front door of a development we got approved last Monday at the other end at Morisset. So
Yeah.
we're a little bit paranoid.
Can't be all the time.
Hey, by the way, Hilton, before you go, I want to do a harangue. I'm going to wave my hands and do a harangue. Neither of these is going to happen unless the council and the councilors, and there's a few of you here, and I'm really glad you're here, are absolutely decisive and get with the program and give those developers absolute certitude that whatever you agree with them is going to happen, like next week, get on it, please, or else this, which is, that's Hilton is the owner of this property, and he just said he likes this one better. Don't expect him to do this if the council fiddles around. If the council fiddles around, I guarantee you he'll do his development approval, his development application right now, and I wouldn't personally blame him. So the onus is on the council to work with that man to make this happen or this happen.
Amen.
Any other questions? I'm sorry I spoke so long. We can break up and be much more informal about this if you would like.
Excuse me, just town centre of the new commercial centre at the base of the North Lakes area on the BHP land.
Yeah,
There's actually a power line easement that comes down.
it's right here.
No, vertically from the, I guess the north, from the top of the page.
Right here?
Yeah, that comes right down to the road. Was that just forgotten about, or was it actually thought to relocate it, or what? What was the thought?
It's the type of power line that you can locate in a street, relocate into a street.
I see, so there's been some thought given.
Oh, absolutely.
Good.
Yeah.
Good question, Paul. Yes.
Jeff, if I may ask a question, I'm very pleased that the railway line has gone to the left-hand side of our...
Well, we hope it's gone.
But that's very important. Well, that's certainly your recommendation, I understand.
Yes.
It would certainly be ours, because it would be a real pity to destroy that estate, because that's what it would do.
Yeah. It's our recommendation if what we have found so far turns out to be right.
Yeah. Chip, I missed the first couple of days. I'm sorry about that, but Hilton was here. What's the purpose of your being here from here on in? Is it the purpose of the council to stay in touch with you and Wendy, or and have a chat from time to time how progress is progressing and seek your input, or what is the future from here on in with you and council?
I could answer that, but I got a hunch Ian would love to explain what council is planning to do and how it involves us.
And getting things running. That will happen with council staff, and the things we are doing is generating other documents and other plans out of the work we're doing with Chip and Wendy to allow changes to occur. It's going to take us a lot of time to do it. We will be putting a new LEP in place, but that's again sometime down the line. I would like to think we could continue an informal relationship with Chip and Wendy, and possibly an even formal relationship beyond the end of the current contract, which will, as I said, finishes after the final document comes in after the final workshop. I'd certainly like that to continue, but again, it's a budgetary issue that we would have to look forward to, seeking extra funds to either bring back Chip and Chip and Wendy as part of the implementation process, or hopefully the council staff will be sufficiently skilled through this process, and it's been very much a learning curve for council, that we will be able to carry the projects as they come up. There's a lot of things, for example, on that plan that are a long, long way in the future, but there are a lot of things in the shorter term that we can achieve. And certainly the issue of your site, for example, is one that we need to address over the next few months, and certainly when the DA. It's as I said, I'd like Chip to have a continuing relationship, but it purely becomes a budgetary role once we complete the current contract with his firm. So, I'm sorry, to also supplement that, council is also putting in place staff called place managers, and each of those place managers will be appointed for either a particular planning district or a particular part of a planning district, and their role will be to achieve some of these outcomes and have them put on the ground over time. I'm, for example, in addition to carrying the role of city strategist, am the place manager for Swansea. I was asked after the very early outcomes at Swansea to make some of or try and make some of the things that we proposed there happen. And we're starting to go down the path to make some of the things occur in Swansea. And so there will be people put in place over the next few months for the various other planning districts to allow some of these things to be put on the ground.
I think it's very important, if I could just reply on that via you, Chip. I think with these consultants, because there is a lot of food for thought here, and Chip's earlier description of the three-legged stool is a particularly sound one, because it doesn't take very much for that three-legged stool to become unseated. And we only have to look at other developments that have been held up for many, many years and have finished up in expensive court cases, only to be won in the long run if the three-legged stool philosophy had been closer observed.
Thank you. I want to note something that I forgot. This is the freeway, and you, Mr. Batman, you made a very good point about the amount of land that's consumed here, or proposed to be consumed here. I forgot to mention that in trade for BHP owns way over here. And I forgot to mention that it seems appropriate to us that that if this much land is to be developed, and we hope that we've got it right in terms of the habitat feasibility at the same time, but that all of this land for the long-term or foreseeable future would stay bush.
You want it in writing.
Well, it's only as good as the will of a council unless it becomes something very, very powerful. But that's something that I forgot to mention. And there will, with this kind of freeway interchange, be growth pressure to be able to get across. It's very easy to hop this freeway, and there needs to be a pretty strong proposal that this bush and this land, which is much steeper and harder to build on, be somehow preserved as a quid quo pro.
Make it a condition of rezoning of the other land.
I should think something like that. Right, right. And the last thing I want to say is that Wendy and I drew hardly any of this. Your council staff drew this and designed this. They have worked. They are now extremely skilled members of this expanded design team, and I'm really pleased to be working with them.
They have gone through an enormous learning curve. They've been exposed to a train of thought that is not common in local government, and I think it's for their benefit as professionals and their own professional development. They've been guided and they're being involved in this process. And I can only again thank Chip and Wendy and Simon for their enormous effort and the enormous bullying that Chip has put us through the last 8 or 9 days, the last 2 weeks, to produce, I mean, an enormous amount of ideas that have come out of this. And again, I'd just like to reiterate for the council, the staff, and the members of the community and stakeholders, a lot of this is extremely long-term idea, and it does need a lot of testing, and that is also part of the process. We need to talk about and look at staging of some of this development. Some of what you see on those plans is eminently feasible. A lot of it may not ever occur, and they're the things we'll be testing over the next few months as part of Lifestyle, that when we eventually produce the documentation as a draft strategic land use plan for the city towards the end of this year and go out on public comment for next year, we'll have hopefully an implementable project that will take the city into the next 20th century, into the next century, sorry. That's all I would like to say, but again, once again, to thank you, Chip, and Wendy, and Simon, wherever he is.
And a whole array of other things that the exciting capacities of life on Earth make possible. And that leads me to, I think, one of the most important points I really want to make. In the last 3 or 4 years, it has sort of come home to me that we don't stress, those of us working on environment really don't stress the positive agenda so much as we're dealing with immediate crises, which then sort of force us into sounding negative, saying, you know, you really shouldn't do that, and stop that. You know, that's too much. Or, you know, you really can't go beyond that limit, or the like. I think it's very easy for us to have fallen in a trap, those of us working on these issues, of sort of painting ourselves as negative and against progress. And I think it's just really the contrary. There is no greater opportunity cost than the cost involved in allowing one of the great lineages of life to become extinct. So the point I want to make here is environmental agendas, by and large, and the biodiversity agenda above all, are really about conserving opportunity and could not be more positive in the end. So thinking about biodiversity here in this country of fabulous biological resources, I mean, just fabulous. You, like every other country, have some problems. There are serious challenges and grave trends. You still have a land clearing, habitat destruction problem. And I note that one of your biologists, Harry Recker, has projected that all things considered, unless certain things change, that literally half of Australia's bird species could be gone in 100 years. And I might say these kinds of projections are another reason that sometimes we sound negative, those of us who work in natural resource management and conservation. We often seem like the prophets of doom and gloom. The only reason one ever makes projections of this sort is to try and put some sense of scale on the problem with the full hope and expectation that those projections will not be borne out because appropriate steps will be taken. Anyway, I don't think as an outsider I need to come and detail to you what the array of environmental challenges exist here in Australia. I do want to, however, draw attention to the value that some creative economics might bring to addressing some of these challenges. And I'm thinking in particular of the kind of work that's now being done in terms of what are called ecosystem services. And what we're talking about here is all the biological diversity that make up an ecological system, such as a watershed, and all of those organisms and the work they do as living things, processing water resources or different kinds of nutrients. So biological diversity really is what's responsible for potable water coming out of a watershed. We've had an interesting example in New York City where the watershed had degraded to the point that the city was about to be required to invest $8 billion in a water treatment plant, and that probably would have ended up being the solution, you know, the technological solution, except somebody was bright enough to think it might be a permanent solution and a cheaper solution to restore the watershed, restore the biodiversity of the watershed, and let it do the job, and it in fact came out at about 1/10 the cost. And there have been some really interesting initiatives to look at national accounting, putting down as assets the natural resources, the living natural resources, as well as the human intellectual resources, that are beginning here and there to change the way people think about net worth and the success of the economics of their particular nation. And of course, the big one out there is the possibility of carbon trading under the Climate Convention, something that I am enormously interested in because I see a way of including forests in all of that, which the Kyoto Protocol of the Climate Convention has yet to bless. But I see that as a way of really tipping the balance in favor of maintaining land and forest cover in many of the developing countries of the world, because you can then begin to add a variety of economic activities for the same piece of forest, which could include ecotourism or minor forest products, and some other things we probably haven't figured out yet. But activities which don't affect the carbon content. So when you start to add all of that up, suddenly it's much more in the owner's interest to leave that piece of land in forest than to convert it into simple timber. So what is Australia's role and Australia's situation looking at the biological diversity issue globally? You know, no nation is without such challenges as Australia faces. But I think some nations have special roles, and I think Australia is clearly one of those, in part because this is a so-called megadiversity country, one that has a significant fraction of global biodiversity, and also because you're a highly sophisticated, developed nation. And I take real heart in some of the things I've run across on this trip, namely the new biodiversity law, which may not be perfection, but it goes a long way to addressing some of the things that need to be addressed. And I think some of the work that Australia is doing in looking at marine environments, strict protection and management way out into the zone of economic interest are probably leading efforts globally. You also have, I think, the leading activity in the world in land care, in sort of restoring degraded lands. And I think the bookmarked Biosphere Reserve down in the Mallee country is plowing new ground, in a figurative sense, all the time in dealing with the complex social issues that involve better stewardship of the land and its biological diversity. Australia is clearly a world leader in the science of biodiversity, including the work of the Australia Biological Resources Study. And if there is any country that is going to be there generating excitement in the age of biological exploration, it will be Australia. Australia is also a leader in information technology as to how it applies to biological diversity, its better use and management. The science ministers of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development approved in June a global biodiversity information facility, which will be an extended electronic network of digital databases about biological diversity, starting with the tremendous amount which is tucked away in the collections of natural history museums and botanical gardens, most of which are in developed nations. And the real truth here is that the global facility is basically just taking the concept started here in Australia of the Environmental Resources Information Network, ERIN, and multiplying it up to global scale. And I should say that Australia, and in particular Evie Nielsen, played a critical role in the 2 or 3 years of work that it took to get to the point of approval by those science ministers in June. And so, in closing, I hope I've been able to convince you that Australia not only has special biological diversity, but also that it has a very special role within the world, within the region, and of course, here at home. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lovejoy. It's now time for questions from our media members, but I should also say that there will be an opportunity for general questions from the floor later in the afternoon. So, but the first question is from Ray Brindle.
From maybe 2 questions, if I could, Dr. Lovejoy. Sure. Thanks. I'm from Dow Jones Newswise. I was particularly interested in the link between biological diversity and food production. And just wondering, in your looking at the world big picture and even Australia, is there any suggestion that food production is going to be seriously limited by a lack of biological diversity at some stage in the medium term?
Well, the whole topic of biological diversity in agriculture is a complex one. Certainly, our major crops and domestic animal species, of course, originally came from the wild, and most of them have regular input from wild relatives in places like the International Rice Institute, where they're always trying to breed more resistant varieties of one thing or another. So as wild relatives of crops are inadvertently eliminated, the capacity to do that clearly is going to be affected. There, of course, is the somewhat controversial topic at the moment of genetically modified organisms, and biological diversity is the source of the genetic material for how you do that, whether you do it right or you do it poorly. And then I think the big sleeper issue is biological diversity in soils, because that's what really generates soil fertility. And there are just going to be lots of places where expensive chemical substitutes for the natural processes will never be possible. So to the extent that we disturb soil biodiversity, we could be creating some serious problems for ourselves. And then the last sort of little bubble on that one are the pollinators, because wild pollinators are often critical in the performance of agricultural crops. I remember an estimate once that every year in New York State there are 3 trillion pollinations of commercial fruit tree species. And, you know, it just begs the imagination to think of people running around with little paintbrushes to do 3 trillion pollinations in the absence of pollinators. And here and there are pollinators in trouble. So yes, it can affect agriculture.
But it also sounds like not particularly in the medium term.
Well, you know, a lot of this loss of biological diversity it's a process of erosion. And it's really difficult to sort of have a threshold effect, but increment by increment, it degrades the capacity of the planet to support agriculture.
I was also wanting to ask on just on genetically modified foods. Many groups in Australia, including doctors, have advised hastening slowly on the uptake of genetically modified products. Is this wise, do you think? Has the risks and benefits of GM organisms been pretty well established by now, or indeed should we just embrace them sort of wholeheartedly as what the companies are telling us is the way of the future?
I think we need to go more slowly and with more care than we have so far. Clearly, there are important benefits to be gained. If genetic engineering can allow us to increase the iron content of rice and therefore improve the diet of 1.5 billion people who eat rice but are iron deficient, that is a huge plus in the world. And as we look at burgeoning human population, the need to increase agricultural production is clearly there, and it becomes desirable to, if possible, without negative environmental impacts, to increase the intensification